Hey guys, Darren Carr here, coach of Wise Ocean Pods, and welcome back to another episode about AFL Fantasy Preseason. On today's episode, we'll be talking about all the popular midfielders, giving my thoughts on what I am looking for in terms of midfield pick, giving some pros and cons and some stats behind my selection. So, without further ado, let's get into it. Enjoy. Alrighty, we're here on the AFL Fantasy website, and before I start getting into some of the selections, I really just wanted to go through some of my thought processes and what's a good midfield pick and what are some of my philosophies when it comes to selecting any player. So the main one I would say, and what most people do, is that they're really looking for value and upside, right? So we're looking for players that are going to increase their value and increase their average from their starting pick. So that can be through a underpriced premium, a breakout candidate, a value player, and obviously rookies, right? So we really want them to increase their average and value, because at the end of the day, this is a salary cap game. The aim of the game is to increase this team value as fast as possible so we can then trade out those players and get the best players available in, and thus scoring the most points on field. That's the way we get ahead. So that's definitely number one. My second philosophy would be, which is a little bit different to most people, is I like to pay up for at least one captain option. You would have seen in my team reveal that I had Bontempelli in my side, and obviously he's the second highest value player, so that's a little harder to explain, but I really find that he's going to be a good captain option, especially with his run. I did explain this in the video, so that's just my second philosophy, where I like to pay up and really secure a second captain pick, where they're going to be trusted in, week out, whether they have a good matchup or not. I can just throw the C on them or a VC and see how they go. I did this with Andy Brayshaw last year. He was the second highest midfielder last year, and it worked quite well for me early on in the season, so I'm looking to do something pretty similar. So the third philosophy I have is that I really like to look for good fixtures, especially for my premiums. I'm a little bit more lenient with value picks and rookies as such, because there's obviously very minimal amount of those. So, but it's really my decision maker, my fixture. So let's just say this year we're talking about Laird and Butters, right? So are they both value? As we know they're both value. I'll touch on them a little bit more in this video, but the way I would decide between the two is just looking at their starting fixtures and really looking at who's got the better run, who's more likely to score the most points, and that really helps me decide. So that's my third one, sorry. And just another one I'd wanted to talk about, especially for the newer players, is that you only select pure midfielders in the midfield line. You don't want to be selecting, say, a James Jordan in your midfield line because he's a forward, right? The midfielders are where we score the most points overall. So you really just want to have the ones that have pure midfield role, and you don't want to have any defenders and forwards, because those are the weaker lines, and you really want to put those players that have that flexibility into those other weaker lines. So, but that's pretty straightforward. So that's just some of my philosophies. Let's get into the selections now. Alrighty, so let's just go ahead and select the mid only and go by team select by. And for reference, guys, today I will not be talking about rookies. I do not claim to be a rookie expert. I rely on the news just as much as everyone else. I don't watch a lot of EFL and all the other state games, so I just rely on everyone else's stats and go from there. So I won't be touching them on this video. So Harley Reid, McKercher, Curtin and Sanders are rookies. Dacos we spoke about in the Defenders video. A reminder that because he has defender status, we see him as a defender. Even though he's going to be playing mainly as a midfielder this year for Collingwood, he is a defender in our eyes, so we won't touch on him. Sean Manor, he is a rookie, so we won't talk about him. Dersmer again, same sort of thing. Flanders, I will talk about in the forwards because he's got forward status. Even though he'd probably play in the midfield for Suns, we'll talk about him in the forwards as he's a good forward pick. So we come to Sharp. Now, I wasn't probably going to really talk about Sharp because he's rookie priced, right? But he has actually played 22 games for the Suns. So I thought I'd just touch on him. He's sort of kind of falls in the category of a mid-pricer to me, really. So let's just have a look at him. So he's priced at 31. He's got a break even at 31. So he's obviously, in my eyes, a smash pick. If we go to his stats of what he did in 2021, he averaged 71, and that actually included a injured 6 games. So he is a smash pick in my eyes if he can lock down that 3-hour wing roll. I can't say that. Wing roll. So, which from all reports, he seems like he's the first candidate for it. And we've seen what Liam Henry was able to do last year, scoring high 80s, even into hundreds. So I think he can do that. He's obviously shown a high ceiling with 123. So, but he can have a low score. But I think he's a smash pick in my eyes. And this is probably one of the reasons why my structure so far is leaning towards having 3 rookies on field, including McKercher, Sanders, and Sharp. I don't think you can have Sharp on your bench. He's going to score way too well to be on your bench, because if he averages 70, that's way too much on your bench. So that's just some of my considerations when picking a starting squad. So lock him into your side. I think he's got that role, and he's going to be a good pick for us. So we'll move on to my next one, which is Zak Butters. So I'll touch on Butters a little bit before, but we all know what he did last year. We were lucky enough to have him as a forward pick last year. So he, in my eyes, is underpriced. We know what he did in last year when he started as a forward in the first 3 games, and his scores obviously reflected that, scoring 59 and 60. Did have a good round 1 score, but if you were to take these 3 scores out, because that's when the role changed, his role then was he averaged 104, which is 4 points upside, I believe. Yeah, so he's priced at 100. He averaged 104, so that means he's 4 points underpriced. Now, that may not sound like a lot, but that sort of puts him on the borderline of being a top 8 midfielder. And I can only see a bit of upside in that, because it'll be his second year in the midfield role. He's only going to get better, so we'll just have to, I think we'll just lock him in. Another thing I like about him as a pick is particularly that Port were the second last for points for last year. I can only see that in improving this year. There's just what does Ken Hinkley have to do? I think he needs to change up the game style a little bit to really start to win some finals. So I would like to see them start to take a bit more possession, tip it around a bit when they need to. It doesn't have to be all guns blazing all the time. So I would like to see that happen a little bit more, and I can only see that increasing. So that could leave a little bit more points on the field for Butters. So that's why I am picking him. He's in my squad at the moment. I think he's M3 from memory. So another pro I like for him is that Port's fixture is quite strong, especially that round 1 matchup against West Coast. Now, we don't only look at one game matchups. I like to look a bit more long term. So he goes West Coast, Tigers, Melbourne, Essendon, Freo, Pies, and St Kilda's. That's a 7-game stretch where he only really comes up against one hard team, and a lot of those others will give up points. So I think he can start the season quite well and really bolster that average quite early on and score us a lot of points. So I am quite favourable with his fixture. Another flag, well, some people are calling it a flag, with Ollie Wines moving back into the midfield full time. But if you actually look at the stats with Zak Butters, he actually averaged 108 when Ollie Wines was in the midfield at 50% or more. So he's actually a better fantasy player with Ollie Wines in the midfield. So I was quite surprised by that. I was a little bit concerned with Ollie Wines coming in a little bit more, but that was a pleasant surprise to see that he could be he's a better player with him in. So The only downside I really have for Zak Butters is obviously he's been quite injury prone in previous years. He actually did quite well last year where he played full 23 games, but there was a lot of concern games where he's so hard at the ball that he can hurt himself quite easily and he can be rested forward. So that's the only concern I have with him, just getting quite banged up here and there. So that's where it could be a bit of a risky play if he, touch wood, he comes out in round one and gets a concussion or something like that. So it's one thing you got to consider, but in most cases, I think he's a smash pick, and I think he will average around that 104 to 108 average for the year. So that really puts him into consideration for my side. Alrighty, so let's move down the list. So Jai Clark is a rookie, won't talk about him. And McRae and Adams are forward players, so we'll talk about them in the next video. So we come to Bontempelli, and he's 25% owned. So some people know what they're talking about. So he's priced at 117. What I like about Bontempelli and what I said in my team review is that he is such a captain option. His floor is so high at 86. Even at 86, if he was your captain, you'd be at least happy that he got to that. Because I think he was tagged in that game quite heavily, so you'd still be quite happy with that. The thing I love about Bontempelli, obviously the price is pretty scary, but I love his open pre-buy run, his fixture. So he only comes up against 3 harder teams until round 16, which is just unreal to think about. So one thing I find hard to believe, if I were not to start, is how am I going to get this guy in? He's priced at over $1 million, and I don't see him dropping below that at any stage in the first half of the season. He's got that friendly of a run. I don't see where he's going to get tagged or where he's going to get a bad score at some stage, unless he gets injured, which we can't control. That I don't see a world where you're going to be able to get him in. So if you don't own him when you do your opening team, how are you going to get this guy in, and how are you going to sell the farm and put yourself behind in other stages to get this guy in? So that's really my thought process, why I'm selecting him and why I'm so bullish at having him as my M1 currently. So the only bad side, obviously, is value. I don't potentially see upside. It's very rare for someone of his price range we've seen in previous years to go. They don't go back to back like they do. Like we saw a Laird last year. He averaged 120. He dropped down to 109. So, and we saw years previously. I don't know them off the top of my head, but it's very rare for a player to go back to back at being this highest scoring player and have this high ceiling. So that's only flag I have really. Besides, there was a bit of an injury in the preseason where he had minor ankle surgery in November, but that seems to all be behind him at this stage. All reports saying he's fit and healthy and is actually tearing up the track. So, and the last thing I had was that the Bevo factor. Is Bevo going to change the game style at the Bulldogs because they missed out on finals? Do they send him forward? I can't see a world where they're going to do that. He's too good in the midfield. He's their ball. And I think that'd be too tall if they send him forward. Like we already know they have plenty of forward talent, so I don't think they need him up there. So I think he was in the midfield and he's in the midfield to stay, so that's why I'm selecting him. And I expect him to sort of average around this mark, maybe a bit lower, about 112 to 116. So a little bit of a drop, but over this great of the giant scheme of things over the season, that's still a massive pick, and I still think he'll be in the top 8 midfielders. So he's a one to keep for the season for me. All right, so moving on, we'll talk about Nat Fyfe in the forward line. Interesting, he's at 23% and rising. He's currently on my side, but we'll move on. Sam Walsh. So Sam Walsh is an interesting one for me. Before the season kicked off, he was a lock in my side, seeing the finals and seeing him come back into form and get past all the injuries that he had in last year. Obviously, his value because of that. He only played 15 games. He had a bit of a back concern, and I think he had some knee issues as well. So let's just look at some of his scores. So he really kicked off the season quite well, but then he started to really slow down with a bit of a role change. I think he went on a bit of an outside. He started dropping in CBAs. The Blues were doing a few different things, so he really dropped his scores, and then he really had an injured game where he missed majority of the rest of the season before coming back in round 24. But one thing you can't see on here was his final campaign was something that we hadn't seen from him in a long time. So if we go back even to years previous, he averaged 103, and I think he even got up to 109 the year prior. So that's where I sort of see he could get back to. But what are the Blues doing in terms of their midfield mix? There's so many mouths to feed in there for me. You got Cripps, you got Hewitt, you got Chera, who's only recently come into the team, and you got Kennedy, who's probably on the outer as well. So that's 5 midfielders already. How do they split that midfield roll up to allow them to all feast and really allow Walsh to get back to his best and get back to that 110 average? So that's just where I see it. Another positive I had for him was just, he moved back into the midfield role in the final 4 games where he really had his ceilings. Let's actually bring that up to show you what I'm looking at. So you look at here. In those final 4 games, he really just jumped back up to that 60 to 70 range where he went ballistic. So he's a good outside player. And a stat I had from him is that when he's at over 60% CBAs, he averaged over 100 in 11 game sample. So he's priced at 95. That's 5 points overs. So, and that could be pushing the top 8 midfielders if he can get that role. So, but currently he's not in my side, and that's why he's not favoured. Just, it's also that early buy. I have already been pretty strong on not paying up for any midfielders, any premiums that have a early buy, just because it's statistically a lot harder for them to average the same as someone who doesn't have the early buy, just because they have that extra game in hand to score that amount of points. So that's why he's just not on my side. And I'm not a fan of his fixture, to be honest. He's got the Tigers first up, which would be alright. Then he's got North, Freo. But after that, he really doesn't come across any decent teams up until the bye. So it's not something I'm super interested in, and the reason why I'm sort of avoiding him and was sort of the decision maker for me to move away from him. Alright, so got Tom Green next, who's at 21%. He is another interesting one. He's spent a bit of time in my side as well. Obviously, he went ballistic last year where I think he was like averaged at 85 and he jumped up to 110. So he had a massive breakout season. A stat I had for him after his bye last year, he averaged 117. So he definitely does have some upside in terms of value. So he could increase that price and become, maybe even top three midfielders with the likes of Merrett and Bontempelli. So I definitely see upside there, and his fixture is something to behold in the first opening round. So North, West Coast, then he does have the bye, unfortunately. Then he's got Suns and St Kilda. I can see him smashing out a 150 in at least 2 of those games. So it's really hard to go against him at this point in time. He's clearly the number 1 midfielder at GWS. His average is 85 to 90 CBAs. We already touched on his fixture being amazing. But when I actually looked into his stats of what he scored against those teams last year, it didn't actually give me a whole lot of confidence because he is a bit of more of a grunt player. He likes to have a bit of competition when it comes to those picks. So he scored a 90 against West Coast and a 73 against North Melbourne. Then he didn't play against Gold Coast, and he scored a 111 against St Kilda. So he didn't even average 100 really there. So it didn't give me a whole lot of confidence, and probably the reason why he's not on my side currently, besides the early bye. And the one thing I wanted to touch on as well is just his kick to handball ratio. Obviously, he's a ball in the midfield, and he's more of a distributor player, so he's really get in, get under, and get that ball handballed out to the outside players. So that really restricts his score. Obviously, he's got a high ceiling of 117 when he can get to the outside and get a few more marks, and he loves the tackle. But he can sort of have a lower games with a 69 when, you know, he's only handballing and he's not really getting on the outside and getting in that transition. So, but I do feel he'll average around this range again this year. I don't probably see the 117 coming out from last year. Just with maybe a few developing players around him coming into the midfield a little bit more, but I still see him as like a 108 to 112 player. So, okay, the next person I'll talk about here is Errol Gulden. So, I was quite surprised to see him at 15%, and he was actually been a bit higher early on in the preseason. But I actually, once I delved into it a little bit, I actually was quite favourable for selecting him, really, even with that early round bye. So looking into his stats, his post-bye average was 117. You can see here his last average was 122, so he obviously had a high ceiling last year and not a hugely low floor. Like 70 is not too bad, especially for the role that he played, where he mainly plays on the wing and comes into the midfield part-time. So it was quite surprising to see that he had quite a high ceiling, so that's a favour for him. Another thing I like about him is that his early fixture is another one that I'm really favourable for. So let me just run through some stats that he went through last year that he'll be facing early on in the season. So he scored a 161 against the Pies last year. He scored a 142 against Essendon, 126 against Tigers, a 145 against West Coast, a 99 against Suns, a 104 against the Hawks, a 132 against GWS, and a 153 against Freo. And that's in his first 9 games. So he's very much in my consideration so far. It goes against my philosophy to really pick him because I don't see upside in him as such. Like, yes, he probably could be 5 points unders, but in reality, with a few of the inclusions like James Jordan and Taylor Adams, what does that do to his role? Like, I think I spoke about this a little bit in other videos, but they already have so many mouths to feed in that midfield role and wing time. So they've got McInerney and Gulden were the two main wing players last year. Now with James Jordan coming in, I'd say he would take a wing role as well. Maybe it's a bit of a rotation between the three of them, and maybe when all three of them are on the ground, one of them gets the inside mid role, which should probably be Gulden. So it's just, I really need to see what that role is going to look like in terms of how does that decrease his time on ground, because he's typically a 90, high 90s, I thought, yeah. So 88 overall, where we see games of 90, 93, 95. Like, he's just an athlete. He's such an athlete. He can run for days. He spreads. He gets marks. He's all over the ground, and his work ethic is so something is very rare to see in fantasy. He just works so hard for the ball and just has a thirst to get the pill and really get it into his hands and get it moved forward. So, while I think he's a good pick, I think he will come back to the pack a little bit this year in terms of average. So I think he'll be about that 105 to 109 overall. Just like I said, with a few mouths to feed, I think a few other people will bob up, and it will mess with his role a little bit. So I just see him coming down a little bit, and that's why he's not quite on my side yet. But he's very much in the squad in his training, and I just need to see a bit more in the preseason. So, yeah. Next one is Jack Steele. So you would have seen in my team reveal that Jack Steele is currently my team, and he has been all preseason. I still think he is a smash pick. We obviously know that what he's capable of. Obviously, in years prior, he did a 121 in 2021 and did a 110 last year, not the year prior, 2022, before having a lot of injury concerns last year where he just missed bulk games and really didn't look like himself. He dropped a bit of weight. His time on ground was quite low, and obviously there was reports coming out that he was managing a knee injury and just playing hurt through most of the games, which why his time on ground was low. In terms of stats, I couldn't really nitpick too many stats here and there, just because he did play most games out. It just was very managed, and it just didn't look right. So obviously 66%, I could have removed that, but I've decided not to do that. All I wanted to really show you was that he averaged 79% overall for the season, whereas back in his prime, the year prior, he's normally a higher 80s to 90% guy. So it really shows you what he should be at and the upside he has for him. So he should be the number one CBA player at St Kilda alongside Crouch, and really move back up to that 90% time on ground and be able to spread with a full preseason and showing he's healthy, with all reports saying that he's having a great preseason and he's having no injury concerns at all. So all looking good so far. Another thing was St Kilda were the second lowest for stoppages, so I only see that increasing, which will improve Steele's points in my eyes, just because he is more of a ball, and that's sort of like a Bontempelli where he's got a bit of a burst and can really kick it out of the stoppage instead of losing the stoppage and not getting those points for it. So he's a good tackler, and I think that's the way he's just going to bump it up. The only downside I have for him is that Ross Lyon, there's been whispers that they're looking to move to a faster game style, and I don't think that really suits Steele as such, because I don't think his outside game is his strength as such. Like, he doesn't spread a whole lot to get those marks. He's more of an inside player, get the grunt, and get those tackles. So he's very much known for his tackle numbers. So he's in my squad at the moment. I think he's M4, so I'm still strong on him. And I think he'll average at 106 and to 110. I think he'll bump it up again and get back to his normal ways. So I think he's a smash pick. And we won't talk about James Jordan. We'll talk about him in the forward line. Next one is Luke Davies-Uniacke. So he's another one that spent a lot of time inside my squad. Obviously, being so young, he's shown a lot of potential in previous years. He's North's number one midfielder with about 90% CBAs most of the time. It's just his injury history. Obviously, he played 14 games last year. We all know about the two very late out picks that he had. Two very late outs and got score 0 for most people. I was lucky enough that in the later one in the season that I was able to move him on before the game started. So he's one I definitely have a lot of experience with. I had him last year for a bulk of when he was scoring quite well. I think I owned him from round 18 through to round 22. I think I just missed out on the Richmond game where I thought he was going to go quite well and he was in my captain considerations. But yeah, he averaged quite well for me in that time. One upside I see for him is just improving that time on ground. There's a lot of fluctuation between his numbers, so 77 to 90%. Like, if he can just get a bit more consolidation with having those higher 80%, then I think he can bump up that average quite nicely. And what I did in terms of stats, I went through his injured games and just sort of removed them. So when he's coming back from injury, I removed that score, and when he had an injury, I removed that score as well. And what I found that he scored 106 overall. So if he can bump up his score to 106, that's nearly 10 points unders, and that will be pushing him to nearly a top 8 midfielder or thereabouts. So I really think he's a good pick, and I'm liking him so far. The only other thing which is maybe the reason why he might miss out on my squad so far when coming round 1 is I'm not a huge fan of their fixture. So they go GBWS, Freo, Carlton, Lions and Cats in the first 5, 2 of them being a harder team, and then the other 3 being neutral teams. So nothing to really be too excited about before coming up against Hawks, Crows and Saints in round 6, 7 and 8. So, but it's just weighing up whether his value is enough to really just not look at it too much and just go for it. But it could be that line ball decision I make between round 1, whether I want to take the risk with him and just select him and hoping he's going to be that top 8 midfielder, or he could have another injury and we could all be trading him out early on in the season again. So, one other thing I want to touch on before I change over as well is just what is that midfield going to look like for North? Obviously, this is sort of technically this is Clarko's second year at North. Obviously, we all know the drama that happened last year with him taking some extended leave away from the club for all different sort of reasons. So, but we'll just have to wait to see what the preseason games look like, what the midfield mix looks like with Wardlaw and Sidcombe, and you got some others, Power. I can't remember the rest of them. There's so many in there. Sheasel as well. There's just so many. They've got so much young talent that they could run through their midfield. Is just if it could drop him down to, maybe a 70% CBA, which would only hinder his scores in my opinion. So. He's more on the outer of my squad. He's still borderline. I think he's my M5 at the moment, but yeah, he could be out of my team before season starts. So that's my thoughts there. The next one is Rory Laird. So he's priced at 109, 30% picked. He had a ceiling of 142 and a low score of 57, which we know was in that round 1 game last year. This is what sort of makes him appealing for me so far, is just that he is a bit of value. Obviously, having that round 1 game of 57, he came out onto the Traders podcast and say that he wasn't a fan of the heat and just was a bit of a slow start. So if you sort of remove that game, he averaged 111.7. So it's a couple points unders, but it really pushes him into that top 8 midfield pick. So, which makes him worthwhile, really. So another stat I found was that he was 5 points better with Crouch in the side, which is a 5-game sample at the end of the last year, but which was interesting to me, thinking that Crouch would take points from him, but it really actually helped him probably get more of his outside game rolling a little bit more, so that was interesting to see. But that's really sort of where it stops for me for Laird in terms of his pros. I don't really expect him to go back to his 120 days in 2022, just with the inclusion of Dawson going into the midfield. And that's not even really considering Crouch at all. I just think Dawson has become that main target in the midfield to really distribute the ball to, because they want to utilise his lethal left kick and really set up the play going through the midfield, whereas that used to be Laird back in 2022, and that just really takes points from him. So while I think he is a bit of value, I think he will average around that 110 to 114 and be around the mark, but I don't think he'll be a smash pick, especially with the talks of Rochelle and Rankin coming into the midfield a little bit more. We saw a bit of Rochelle last year in the early season, so I expect to see that a bit more this season. And Rankin, his second year at Adelaide, so there's whispers that he'll be coming into the side as well, just to add a bit of speed and a different dynamic into the squad. So does that lower Laird's CBA count? Possibly. Does he have to play a different role? Does he go back to that defensive role that he had back in, I can't remember when he had it back a few years ago now. So I just don't see where it leaves Laird at this point in time. Just with a few more names coming into the midfield. And another thing I wanted to talk about was just the early fixture. As I always do, touch on the fixture. Their fixture is probably one of the worst when it comes to early rounds. So they go Suns, Cats, Freo, Melbourne, and Carlton. Three of them being harder teams, and then 2 being neutral teams before coming up Essendon and North. So nothing really to be excited about, and really is one of the main reasons why I won't pick Laird at this point in time. So, and that's probably can be said for the exact same for Dawson. I know he's a little bit more ways down at 11%, but he's sort of very much similar in that mould where the fixture's horrible. Frank and Rochelle coming to the midfield. And an interesting stat I saw about Dawson was that he is actually 11.7 points worse off with Crouch coming into that midfield in that back end of last year. So whether that's just whether that was just a factor of maybe it was a back end season where he was getting a bit tired and fatigued, and he was just spending a little bit more time outside, so he wasn't getting as many points. But I can only go off the data, and I think he'll drop away a little bit come this year. So, but in saying that, he is the captain of the side, and people look for him in transition, like I was saying before. So, in summary, I think he'll probably drop down to a 102 to 106 average, probably just on the outside of the top 8 midfielders. I haven't really considered John Dawson at this stage. So that's that one. I'll just go back up to Andy Brayshaw. So I've seen a lot of interest in Andy Brayshaw so far. I've seen him in a lot of high quality coaches teams, but I'm a little bit skeptical in terms of his role coming this year. Just with the inclusion of, you got Hayden Young, you got Naf Fife, you got Erasmus and Johnson, who are all looking for midfield rotations now. So how do they all fit these guys in, including Sarong, who sort of became that main midfield guy last year, and it really looked to be that main guy for Freo. So I just don't see where that leaves Brayshaw at this point in time. But I will say he is a much better outside player. So even if he were to sort of be moved out onto a wing, sort of part-time, I think he could benefit from that and get a little bit more chip and a few more marks to really bump up his score a little bit. But it's a little bit of a risky play for me because I'm not a huge fan of picking players that aren't on the ball majority of the time. Even with a sort of an Errol Gulden, it can be a very hot and cold sort of area where the ball can be stuck on one side of the field, and Brayshaw or Gulden could be on the other side, and they're just not getting anywhere near it for an extended period of time, and that can really limit their score. So it's a lot of money to pay up for someone who may be on a wing for me. So that's one of the reasons why I haven't really considered him too much. I do love that he has a high ceiling. We saw even in the year prior, he scored a 181, which is one of the highest scores we've seen in a long time. But his floor isn't too bad as well. Like a 72 isn't too much to worry about. I'd say he got tagged in that game. An interesting stat I had as well, in those 5 games which Hayden Young went into the midfield last year, it was actually average 116.4. So that's actually right there. So he was 6 points better off in those last 5 games with Hayden Young coming to midfield. So it's a bit of an unknown for me. Some of the stats say that he'll be better off, but I just don't. In the way I see the game, I don't see how he improves. I think he'd be there or thereabouts, or even regress a little bit. If I had to put a number to it, I'd say he'd probably be about that 108 average by the end of this year. And just touching on his fixture, it's nothing to really get too excited about. He goes Lions, North, Crows, Carlton, Port, and West Coast in the first 6. So a couple of good games there, but a couple of bad ones as well. So nothing too excited to get. Nothing that would make me want to pick him as such. So that's my thoughts. Next one would be Touk Miller. So He's one that's probably not as talked about as much. We know what he can do. Similarly to Steele, obviously had that really huge season in 2021 where he went 122, which was just unreal. Then dropped away a little bit in 2022, and then again last year, just couldn't get the ball. Had a lot of injuries and only played 13 games. So he's obviously value for that. Let's go back here. Only priced at 96. So if he can get back to his, close to 110, that's obviously a smash pick. But I don't think he'll get there in terms of that. Just with a few inclusions, with a new coach, Demo Hardwick, what does he do with that midfield role? We saw Touk at some stages last year, went onto more of a wing role, then pushed out of the midfield as such with Noah Anderson. You got Bailey Humphrey going through there. You got Sam Flanders. You got Rowell as well. Does he go to those more youthful players rather than a Touk Miller, who's still in his prime, don't get me wrong? Does he just see more of an upside in those players as such? Obviously, the early buy is a flag for someone so expensive, but you could weigh up, is the value worth picking him? The fixture for this Gold Coast Suns isn't too bad in terms of hard matchups. Going Crows, Dogs, and they had the bye. Then they have Giants, Hawks, Swans, West Coast, Lions, and North up until round 9 before having a couple of harder ones. So it's nothing too crazy, but nothing I wouldn't stop me from picking him either. So just looking at some of his numbers, I just saw that he had a low score of 49. Obviously, that was a injured game where he had an extended period out. I think it was a knee injury from memory. Obviously had limited game time coming back in, whereas, like I was saying with Jack Steele, Touk Miller is normally a higher. That's not right. He's normally a higher 90% guy. I don't know why this is bugging out, but he's normally a higher 90% time on ground guy. So I expect him to get back up to those numbers. I haven't heard a huge amount about him in the preseason, so he'll be a bit of a watch come into the match sim games and the Amy community games. So, and even round 0. So that's a good thing. We get to look at him. If he scores well, then he could be a consideration for us. But I think Dimmer Hardwick has come out and said that they're going to feed Flanders a little bit more. So Touk Miller's not really in my considerations at this point. So that's just my thoughts. Alrighty, so moving on to the last couple here, we got George Wardlaw at 10.74%. Now, you would have seen in my team review here, I was quite bullish on Wardlaw just with some of the things that I saw in his stats. He should be the second CBA holder at North. Just obviously being such a profound talent, I think he's a midfield ball ready to explode, and I think he should get closer to the 80% average. It's just whether he has the right role. So that's one of the main things. Obviously, if we look back at his stats from last year, you would see he has minimal time on ground at mid-60s, even some low 70s. I think that should at least bump up to closer to 80%, like his mate LDU. So that just only leaves upside for him realistically. He's a profound tackler, so he loves to cuddle. He could be a bit better on the outside where he gets a bit more marks here and there, but he's just such a ball, and I think he can really accumulate and get some higher ceiling games. So, but he is an injury risk. He obviously missed a bunch of last year. I think it was mainly through hamstrings and just a few other knocks here and there. We're just not a clean preseason, so yeah, that's always a risk. But from all reports saying he's fit and healthy, he's playing well, he's tearing up the match sims. So just be a wait and see. The only other flag I had with him was, what is the North Melbourne mix going to look like? Similar to LDU. I touched on Sheasel, Simpkin, Powell and Phillips, even a Lazaro runs through there, how many are they going to squeeze into that midfield rotation, and is that going to limit his time on ground and CBAs, so that limits his ceiling? So just be a bit of a watch, but currently he's still on my side at M6, and I'm still quite bullish, and I think he still could get to that 80 average. I'll touch on Merrett. He's just below 10%, so Merrett is definitely playing close to my squad. He was probably my second best captain option behind Bontempelli. He is, in my eyes, the best fantasy player of the last decade. An interesting stat I looked into was that he hasn't averaged below 100 since his debate season in 2015. So he's done it for a very long time and has been one of the top fantasy players for us for a very long time. So he's pretty much a smash pick every single year. He's one you're just going to hold on to, and he's just going to score consistently every single round. So he's the number one pick, a number one midfielder at Essendon, maybe alongside Parrish. He's one of the better users of the footy in that football club, so his teammates look for him, especially because he's the captain. So he really leads the ship when things go wrong, and they really search for him. So that's why I think he's a good pick. Another good thing about him is the fixture. I do like Essendon's fixture here and there. It's pretty decent, just coming up against Hawks, St Kilda, West Coast and North in the first 10 rounds. So I can see quite a few ceiling games there. It's just whether you can pay up enough for him to be that captain option. But the only downside I really see for him is that he's probably not got any upside to him. Priced at 113, that's probably just about where he'll be by the end of the season, so there's no real upside in terms of that. He'll just be a consistent player for you, and he is the main target for Essendon, so he can cop a bit of attention here and there, which can lead to some lower scores, but he is generally pretty good at breaking those and still putting up a decent score. Like you can see, he still had a pretty good floor of 80, so I still think he's a smash pick, and I couldn't talk people out of him being their captain option if that's the way they want to go. I'll probably just touch on one other here. I won't talk about Lazaro, he's a forward. I'll probably just talk about Crouch here just because he is just below 10%, but I think Crouch is a good player. So looking into his stats, if you look at the back end of last year, he did play the last 6 games, that's 4 games, and he did average 97.5. So what is he priced at? He's priced at 81, so that's 16 points upside, which is quite significant when you're talking that sort of price range, and can easily be that mid-pricer that can bolster your midfield and can increase quite quickly if he gets away in the season, early in the season. One other interesting thing I saw before is that his time on ground's quite low, considering he's a more mature player. Where is he gone? He's 28 now, so he's in the prime of his career. You'd think he's a bit more fitter than that. He should be pushing closer to 80, if not 85%. But looking back at his stats previously, even when he was nearly a 110 guy, he's always been that mid-70s sort of percent on ground. So it really limits his ceiling in terms of, really scoring higher points. And one other downside I had with him, he's just an accumulator. So he gets a lot of disposal. So you can see he gets quite a lot of 30 touches, but then he has minimal marks and minimal tackles. So he really doesn't have that high ceiling. Like even 120 is a decent score, but it's not like a top premium midfielder where they're scoring 150s, 160s, So just wanted to touch on him. I think he could be a good pick if he goes well in early on in the season, but he's not currently in my side, mainly just because of that fixture, as I talked about with Dawson and Laird. I'm not a huge fan of their fixture early part of the season, so I do expect them to probably start a little bit slower and then build into as the season goes on. So, that's my thoughts. Alrighty, guys, so that's all I'll touch on for today. I'll touch on those lesser owned players in another video and maybe a pod video, just sort of give some of the sneak peeks of what I'm considering later on in another video. But hope you enjoyed today's episode, just touching on all the popular midfielders and looking at what I'm looking for. Hope you enjoyed the video, and like and subscribe if you want to see more. And give me some of your feedback. Give me some things that you are considering so far. Who's in your team? Interested to see what your guys' thought processes are, and maybe you have some insight that I'm not aware of, and it would be nice to see and get some more conversations going around the channel. So, yep, please like and subscribe, and I'll catch you for the next episode. Enjoy. Cheers.